Hello, everyone, and welcome to another session of the Cooperation Tulsa Organizer Education Group. We are continuing our reading of Full Spectrum Resistance, and I will just transition us over to the reading group room here. So let me get this set up. Boom.
So while he's fixing technical difficulties, how's everybody's night going?
You are very quiet, by the way, Dom.
Monday, I am mad about it.
Very quiet. I'm very quiet.
Now you're not. Now you sound good. So let me go to.
Now you're not. Now you sound good.
Oh. I cannot hear anything that y'all are saying through my laptop, and I don't know why. I don't have it muted.
Oh, that's weird. You don't hear this?
Nope, I heard you there, but I don't hear anybody talking right now.
What about this? Do you hear me?
I do. Maybe
Did
y'all
you
were
hear
just
me?
not talking for a minute. I don't know. Yeah, I hear y'all fine now.
So if somebody just wants to go to the live stream, or if somebody's watching the live stream, if they can tell us if you can hear anybody but me, if you can hear the rest of the participants. If so, then I have got this set up in record time. I am a live streaming master.
I think we've not been fairly talkative up until this point, so any quietness is probably just us being quiet.
Yeah, I learned what push to talk is today.
All right. Well, people in the
That way I
stream
don't
say they
cough
can
into the
hear
mic
it.
through the reading again.
All right. So I think everything should be good now. Let's name numbers here in the chat and determine the order of readers. Wow, so eager. You can't hear. Wow, I just realized I had myself muted in the meeting room here.
I was wondering if
That's
that
funny.
was a technical difficulty.
Well,
or
I'm
not.
super glad somebody said something. Damn.
That's what was confusing me, because I've got the live stream pulled up on YouTube, and I could hear you talking, but I couldn't hear you over here, and I was like, something's wrong with my. But no, this time is your fault. Thank you.
Yep, that's correct. That's correct. Not as uncommon as it might seem. So okay, we stopped last time at the liberal class. Looks like we've got a few people who have showed up. Before we get started, I am going to share this link in a few places so that people know what's happening. If people want to do the same, you go ahead.
You're talking about sharing the YouTube link?
Yeah, the link to the live stream.
Got it.
Okay. Let's see. We'll put it in the Anark server. All right. So I put it in places where people can watch. Cool. I think we are pretty much ready to go. So I will get us started. The liberal class. Writer and journalist Chris Hedges uses the term liberal class to include parts of the press, labor unions, and universities, as well as liberal religious institutions and elected officials, like the Democrats. In his book of the same name, he traces the history of these liberal pillars since their time of relative success before World War I to the present day. The liberal class, writes Hedges, has historically served as a kind of safety valve, allowing gradual change. Excuse me. When major pressure has built up against oppression and exploitation, liberal institutions like the media and political parties have helped to make compromise that allow incremental progress. However, the liberal class has grown weaker and weaker because it has continually ceded ground to corporate power, been bought off by the privileges of comfortable positions in the social hierarchy, and because it has functioned as an attack dog against the radical social movements that drive real change. Hedges argues that liberal institutions, in order to seem more appealing to the corporate establishment, have purged themselves of radical and independent thought. This was especially egregious and obvious during the period of McCarthyism, when those critical of capitalism or corporate power were blacklisted, ending their careers and sometimes their lives. This process of intellectual cleansing has had a profound and negative impact on the effectiveness of liberal institutions. Hedges argues, robbing them of vitality and innovative thought. Meanwhile, the comfortably employed members of the liberal class chose ineffective tactics because they were ineffective, since being genuinely effective would threaten their privilege and comfort. With future prospects for human justice and planetary survival continuing to worsen, will liberals as a group be able to find a fighting spirit in time? Hedges is blunt. Quote, "The liberal class cannot reform itself. It does not hold within its ranks the rebels and iconoclasts with the moral or physical courage to defy the corporate state and power elite. It's true," or end quote. It's true, as Hedges argues, that the liberal class lacks those people because it has deliberately expelled or excluded them. Next.
But I would argue that this tendency dates back not to the McCarthy era, but to the beginnings of liberalism in early modern Europe. Ever since John Locke, the liberty in liberalism was the freedom to enjoy the use of property. And while liberalism seemed like a step forward from the control of the king or the church, it was mostly a step forward for people of privilege. After all, what use is the freedom to enjoy your property if you have no property? For working class people, the dispossessed, those pushed off their farms, those who were never paid enough to accumulate property, radical political change was much more appealing. And radical political change requires collective action. At the same time as Locke and other political thinkers were writing about liberalism, radical political movements in Europe, like the Diggers and the True Levelers, were trying to redistribute land and property. These movements would sometimes take over blocks of agricultural land for subsistence farming, a tactic that would be used centuries later by groups like the Landless Workers Movement in Latin America. In some sense, collective action is the basis of radicalism. People with very little power can only create real change by working together. Liberalism, in contrast, is individualistic at its base because of its emphasis on personal property. This individualism has also led liberals to overemphasize respectability in their approach to social change, something that we'll see in our discussion of the gay rights movement in chapter 5. Individualism and respectability are huge barriers to resistance, but they also became baked into middle-class values. A.K. Thompson argues that at some point the middle class, quote, came to value peace, a life free of conflict above all. This peace found its precondition not in the resolution of historic contradictions, but rather in their avoidance, end quote. Next.
For me, the danger of the liberal class is not merely its complicity with state and corporate crimes, but its claim that it represents all those who are fighting for equality or justice. Its relative dominance in the political and cultural landscape means that it often sets the agenda for social change. It also sets the default tactical boundaries for mass movements in much of the world. And it will continue to do that until radicals assert themselves, reclaim their history, and organize outside the stifling bounds of the liberal left. I would actually have a lot more respect for liberals in general if they were more honest. Imagine a liberal said to me, I want to have social change and a livable planet, but I'm actually very comfortable and I'm too scared to risk that. We could at least have a frank conversation. But the usual response to the prospect of resistance is a series of reflexive responses. It's not possible to fight back. Change only ever comes by persuading those in power. Change can only happen inside ourselves. It's too soon. You can't convince someone by breaking the law. We should just use nonviolence like Nelson Mandela. These responses may be factually wrong, but more importantly, they are dishonest. They are bullshit. They allow liberals to sidestep the real reasons they don't want to take action, like fear of losing their comfort and privilege. But in order to rationalize their inaction, they have appropriated and sanitized the history of social change on this planet. They have claimed credit for victories won through radical action, like the end of segregation, or women's right to vote, or the 8-hour day. And when social struggles in history have achieved victory using a diversity of tactics, as I will discuss in a few pages, liberals have expunged the dirty tactics from their version of the story until they have a narrative that is tidy, sanitized, and wrong. The great social justice changes in our country have happened when people came together, organized, and took direct action, end quote, explains Dolores Huerta, co-founder of the United Farm Workers. The civil rights movement, the labor movement, the women's movement, and the equality movement for our LGBT brothers and sisters are all manifestations of these rights. If we want to win, we have to fight. Next.
All right, the myth of pacifist persuasion. This is also a really good section. The left in general has some deep misconceptions about what makes oppressed groups able to overturn systems of control. Sometimes the liberal left sanitizes the histories of groups or struggles to make them seem more appealing, i.e., pacifist. This even happens to current struggles. As I began drafting this chapter, there were vigorous struggles for revolution and liberation in Egypt. At various points, I have heard liberals celebrate Egyptian protesters for being nonviolent, even as those protesters battle with police live on TV, and even as Egyptian organizers themselves explain that they are not pacifists. Along with a tendency for liberals to ignore tactics they don't like, liberals are also prone to idolize historical leaders based on their perceived personal characteristics. I have no problem with celebrating those who have sacrificed and struggled for justice. I do have a problem with focusing only on their personality, on the personalities of a few leaders without questioning what made their strategy effective, or for that matter, questioning whether it was effective at all. All of these tendencies are dangerous because they keep us from learning essential strategic lessons from history. Let's examine a few important and successful liberation movements of the last century, movements that resonated with liberals and radicals alike. An unsanitized look at their history can tell us both what is wrong with the mythology of the liberal left and what we actually need if we want to win. I'll begin with Nelson Mandela, who has become an icon for pacifists. A number of times in the past, when I have spoken publicly in favor of militant action, someone present has disagreed and used Mandela's struggle in South Africa to argue that nonviolence is the only way. But Mandela was never a pacifist, and the South African liberation strategy was not nonviolent. Some people think of Mandela as a pacifist because his approach eventually brought about an end to the violent system of apartheid, and because he spent 3 decades in prison. Pacifism is closely associated with the idea of martyrdom, especially in Christianity. But the reason Mandela had been arrested in the first place was because he was a founder and leader of the African National Congress's militant underground wing. They staged a struggle for decades that incorporated non-cooperation, property destruction, and violent attacks on government agents. This struggle succeeded when the apartheid government could no longer cope with escalating disruption in South Africa and around the globe, and was forced to negotiate peace. Mandela staunchly supported these tactics throughout his imprisonment. He was offered release by the South African government if he would endorse pacifism, but he always refused. He was quite clear: nonviolence is not a moral principle, but a strategy, and there is no moral goodness in using an ineffective weapon. Yep. Perhaps the South African struggle's association with nonviolence emerged from the solidarity boycotts and divestment campaigns that took place around the world. These were important tactics of the struggle, but they were not the only tactics. I'll talk more about Mandela and how the ANC organized in Chapter 6. For now, remember that the ANC's struggle for liberation included both sabotage and armed resistance. Next.
Even the international solidarity campaigns included direct economic attacks and sabotage against apartheid-supporting companies like Shell. Casimir Brand offers some examples. Many acts of sabotage occurred in Denmark, Holland, and Sweden during the years 1986 and 1988. Shell stations were attacked with firebombs and paint in addition to the cutting of gasoline hoses and damage to gas tanks and cash machines. In 1986, a spokesman for Danish Shell admitted that the boycott had not affected them much economically, but that sabotage was costing them vastly larger amounts of money. Indeed, and this was a very important point. A broad diversity of tactics was used to achieve success. Successful resistance movements apply many different tactics. They prioritize some tactics over others, but those tactics always involve the use of force, whether that is economic force through mass boycotts, political force through civil disobedience, or physical force. They do not function by offering the oppressors a convincing argument or a moral principle. In the popular imagination of the Western world, the struggle for Indian independence is probably the most famous story of a victory achieved through nonviolence. But the history is not so simple. It's true that there were several major nonviolent campaigns with Mohandas K. Gandhi in the leadership, but there were also militant or armed campaigns against the British occupiers occurring simultaneously. Gandhi's first major civil disobedience campaign began in 1920. The participants protested, boycotted British goods, and supported the local craft-scale manufacturing. The campaign continued until the Chari Chara incident, when 3 nonviolent protesters were killed by police. A mob responded by burning down a police station and killing 22 police officers. Gandhi personally called off the campaign for the entire country because he felt that it was straying from his values. Next.
Gandhi's decision to abort the campaign undermined the broader movement. Having lost their main strategy, formerly united religious factions turned on each other, and a classic example of how ineffectiveness drives horizontal hostility.
Hey Dom, you're very quiet right now. I don't know if you need to get closer to the mic or.
Well, now you're completely silent.
Yeah, now we can't hear anything.
Nope, just silent.
I was able to hear you. You were just very quiet, much lower than everyone else.
Maybe we can move forward to the next reader and then circle back to Dom.
Should we stay with you, Dom, or should we move to the next reader? We'll just move it to the next reader. Who's next?
Dang, that would be me. And I was hoping I wouldn't get this section because I can't pronounce half the words in it.
Right,
but
right.
Here we go. Okay. Where were we? Gandhi's decision to abort the campaign undermined the broader movement. Having lost their main strategy, formerly united religious factions turned on each other, in a classic example of how ineffectiveness drives horizontal hostility. The end of the civil disobedience campaign prompted riots as some Muslims and Hindus attacked one another. The termination of that campaign also drove many people toward more militant action. One of those people was, does anyone know how to pronounce that name?
Bhagat
Bhagat
Singh.
Singh.
Bhagat
Yeah,
Singh.
looking at Theo on it. Okay.
As a teenager, Singh had participated in Gandhi's non-cooperation campaign, but once it was called off, Singh became an armed revolutionary and socialist writer. After a leading nonviolent activist was beaten to death by police, Singh and his group killed a police officer in response. When police powers against dissidents were expanded, Singh's group set off a bomb in the Legislative Assembly, though they were careful that the bomb didn't injure anyone. Singh and 2 comrades were captured and executed. They were celebrated as martyrs, and their deaths inspired others to militant action and radical political thought. Does anyone know how to pronounce this name?
Subhas
Is that what it is?
Chandra Bose. Or
Bose?
Bose, sorry. Yeah,
Okay.
Subhas Chandra Bose.
Subhas Chandra Bose was perhaps the best known and most popular militant leader. Bose was twice elected leader of the Indian National Congress, the large independence organization associated with Gandhi. But after the non-cooperation campaign was canceled and militant action grew, divisions developed. Bose felt that the INC had failed people like Singh. Bose came into conflict with Gandhi and resigned from the INC to form his own political party. When the Second World War began, Bose knew that the British would be weakened and distracted. The war would offer a perfect opportunity for an escalated independence struggle. He organized the Indian National Army, an armed force numbering more than 40,000. Bose also controversially aligned the INA with the Japanese against the British. Bose, the INA, and other militants began a guerrilla war against the British. During the war, the Indian National Congress called for a new civil disobedience campaign. The Quit India campaign began in 1942, but repression was swift. Most of the INC leadership was imprisoned on the first day. The Indian people responded with a variety of tactics as they saw fit. Many used walkouts, strikes, and boycotts. When protesters were attacked, some fought back, striking government offices and police stations or burning military vehicles. Others went after the infrastructure, severing railways, electrical lines, and telegraph lines. Next.
Meanwhile, independence fighters built the clandestine infrastructure they needed to function under a repressive regime, setting up radio stations, communication networks, and administrative structures. Parallel institutions are essential for successful revolutionary movements. During the war, several areas in India managed to set up their own independent local governments, which ran until Gandhi instructed that they be shut down in 1944. At that point, Quit India was more or less over. When World War II ended, captured officers of the Indian National Army were put on trial. They received a major outpouring of public support. As a military force, the INA was very small, but as soldiers on trial, they had a major political impact and inspired other resistance. And the INA trials would help trigger a crucial mutiny. In 1946, while the INA trials were ongoing and the country was seething with rebellion, discontentment grew in the Royal Indian Navy. Indian sailors, unhappy with the occupation of the country and with their own poor treatment by British officers, decided to start a strike. They elected a Naval Central Strike Committee and used their naval wireless sets to organize between ships. The strike quickly spread into a general mutiny that included the crews of 78 ships and some 20,000 sailors. The striking sailors ignored or expelled officers rather than harming them. The mutiny quickly brought a negotiated settlement from the Crown, with amnesty promised to the sailors. But once the strike stood down, many of them were arrested or court-martialed in a betrayal of British promises. It's no surprise that the colonial government lied, but the sailors were also abandoned by Gandhi, who attacked them for acting, quote, without the guidance and intervention, unquote, of the, quote, political leaders of their choice, unquote. Of course, the sailors had their own leaders in the form of an elected committee and coordinated their actions through the committee and through their wireless sets. Perhaps Gandhi's problem wasn't that the strike was not coordinated, but that it was not coordinated by him. Though it ended quickly, the mutiny created major panic inside the British government. It was a clear sign that large numbers of Indians were ready to abandon a strategy of nonviolence and switch to an outright armed insurgency. In that case, the British would totally lose their considerable investments, assets, and influence in the region. World War II had thoroughly drained the military resources of the British. They knew that they lacked the military might to suppress an armed uprising in India. So in 1947, they granted India a negotiated independence. Next.
Is that me? I think it is.
Yeah, that's you.
Okay. So what was it that actually won India's independence? Nonviolent civil disobedience campaigns or the use and threat of armed rebellion? Even if we were to ignore the more militant components of the Indian resistance, as many liberals do, we can't ignore the fact that the British Empire was devastated by the incredible violence of World War II. Regardless of how violent or nonviolent Indian resistance was, the international situation for the British Commonwealth during World War II was one of considerable bloodshed. The British Prime Minister in 1947, Clement Attlee, stated, as many historians have, that Quit India had a minimal impact and that it was the INA and the mutiny of the Navy that actually forced the British to capitulate. One historian argues that there is, quote, no basis for the claim that the civil disobedience movement directly led to independence. The campaigns of Gandhi came to an ignoble end about 14 years before India achieved independence, end quote. Holy shit, that is damning. Given these facts, why is it that Gandhi is so well known in North America, while the more militant factions are relatively obscure? One reason is that Gandhi was invited by the British to participate in the independence negotiations. The British did not want more defiant leaders to be present at the table, and some of the more prominent militant leaders were killed during the independence struggle. Bose went missing in action in 1945, and his body was never found. The British didn't only want to keep militants away from the negotiating table, they didn't even want people to know they existed. The BBC was banned from reporting on groups like INA. The British government didn't want anyone getting any ideas in India or other British colonies. Compare that media blacklisting to the treatment of Gandhi, whose life was made into a major film. In any case, I'm not going to try to assign priority to one part of the independence struggle over another. It's pretty clear that both militant and nonviolent campaigns had critical roles to play in building resistance and in fighting the British. The nonviolent campaigns mobilized millions of people, and the militant campaigns made it clear that those millions might not stay nonviolent forever. Without both wings of the movement, it's unlikely that the Indian independence struggle would have seen victory. With both wings in action, they accomplished something momentous. Also, let me be clear, the essential problem with the myth of pacifist persuasion is not about pacifism, but about persuasion. I'll reiterate, you cannot persuade a dictator, a sociopath, or a corporation by moral argument or pacifism. But, and this is important, neither can you persuade them by violence. The distinction is not violent versus nonviolent, but ineffective versus effective. Change does not happen because those in power change their hearts and mind. It happens because those in power have no choice but to change their actions, or eventually, because their power structures are systematically, or their actions, or eventually, because their power structures are systematically dismantled. The task of the resistor is not to change the minds of those in charge, but to mobilize a movement that can exert general political and economic force, and to choose the tactics and strategies that will make that movement effective. Next.
Mandela and Gandhi are well known. But in North America, when people think of nonviolence, they think of the civil rights movement of the 1960s. But is that perception true? Let us take a few minutes to trace the use of nonviolence and other tactics in the American civil rights struggle. Let's begin in 1954, when the US Supreme Court issued a ruling in the case of Brown v. Board of Education, declaring that all schools in the United States would become integrated. School boards began slowly to make that transition. Many white Southerners, however, were unhappy with the decision, and that discontent boiled over in Little Rock, Arkansas in 1957. The Little Rock School Board had a plan of integration scheduled to begin in the fall of 1957. 9 high school students were granted admission to the formerly white Little Rock Central High, but they were prevented from entering the school by a white mob. The mob was supported by Arkansas Governor Orval Faubus, who sent troops from the National Guard to bolster the mob's numbers. President Eisenhower tried to convince the governor to stand down and obey the decision of the Supreme Court. After 2 weeks of unsuccessful attempts at persuasion, Eisenhower decided to use force. He sent in the 101st Airborne Division of the U.S. Army to protect the Black students. The students were driven to school in a convoy escorted by Army jeeps with mounted machine guns. Once inside the school, each Black student was personally escorted by a soldier armed with a rifle and bayonet. The Black students were still harassed by some of their classmates, but the soldiers protected them from more overt violence. Governor Faubus would retaliate the following year by shutting down all the public schools in Little Rock to try to derail the process of integration. In Mississippi, integration at the university level provoked a similar but larger conflict. In 1961, a Black student, James Meredith, applied to the all-white University of Mississippi. He was not granted entry. He and his lawyers began a series of legal challenges alleging that Meredith was rejected because of the color of his skin. The case made it to the Supreme Court, which ruled that the university had to accept Meredith. But again, the state establishment defied the Supreme Court. Indeed, the governor of Mississippi personally came to turn Meredith away when he attempted to visit the registrar's office. Federal marshals were sent to escort Meredith and ensure his safety. When James Meredith was finally able to enroll in the fall of 1962, there was an immediate and violent response on the university campus. Students and Mississippians rioted by the thousand, attacking the hundreds of federal marshals and border guards tasked with protecting Meredith. In response, President Kennedy sent in 16,000 federal troops to quell the racist uprising. Swaths of the campus were burned or destroyed by the rioters. One military police officer, a veteran of the war in Vietnam, said he preferred being in Vietnam to dealing with the rioters. Next.
When the riots were over, 2 people were dead, 28 U.S. Marshals had been shot, and 160 soldiers had been injured. Some called it the last battle of the Civil War. Meredith himself was safe, though in 1966 he was shot in an assassination attempt. He would recover. Those on the front lines of the civil rights struggle were not naive about the nature of segregation. They understood that segregation would not end by persuasion alone, and that force, including the threat or use of violence, would be required. James Meredith, a military veteran, was very explicit on this point. Decades after his graduation from the University of Mississippi, he explained, "I was engaged in a war. I considered myself engaged in a war from day one, and my objective was to force the federal government, the Kennedy administration at that time, into a position where they would have to use the United States military force to enforce my rights as a citizen." End quote. The Freedom Rides, the series of bus rides in which white and Black activists traveled through the South to defy the rules of segregation, used the same principle. One Freedom Rider called himself a soldier in a nonviolent army. James Farmer, the director of the Congress of Racial Equality, CORE, explained that they knew the Freedom Ride would trigger attacks by racist mobs. Quote, and we felt that we could then count upon the racists of the South to create a crisis so that the federal government would be compelled to enforce federal law, end quote. And it worked. The racist attacks grew with each city the Freedom Riders passed through. This was organized violence, planned by both the police and the Ku Klux Klan. In Anniston, Alabama, the Ku Klux Klan surrounded the bus and blocked the exits before setting it on fire. Through some stroke of luck, the mob backed off for a moment, and the Freedom Riders were able to leave the bus before burning alive. But as they fled, they were severely beaten and almost lynched. Some of them were sent to hospital but were refused medical care and had to flee the hospital after another angry mob gathered. At the next stop, Birmingham, they were again attacked and severely beaten. In Montgomery, Alabama, the conflict came to a head. Freedom Riders were mobbed and viciously beaten as police looked on. Local civil rights organizers had to rescue the injured because ambulances would not take them to the hospital. The next evening, there was a rally at a Baptist church in Montgomery with Martin Luther King Jr. among the speakers. Some 600 federal marshals were sent in to guard them. They were attacked by thousands of angry racists who set cars ablaze and injured marshals. President Kennedy again threatened to send in federal troops, but in the middle of the night, the governor of Alabama relented, declared martial law, and sent in the National Guard to escort the Freedom Riders. As James Farmer recounted, that ride from Montgomery to Jackson was like a military operation. As we rode on the bus, there were Alabama National Guardsmen on the bus with us, about 6 of them with bayonets fixed on their rifles. There were helicopters chopping around overhead. When they arrived in Jackson, Mississippi, however, the Freedom Riders were all arrested and thrown in jail. So civil rights organizers called in reinforcements until the jails were filled to overflowing. One of the reasons that a single person like James Meredith or a group like the Freedom Riders could catalyze such enormous change was because they did eventually have the backing of an armed force. And while federal support was uneven and ambiguous, many parts of the South were unambiguously and violently opposed to desegregation. In some areas, it was not uncommon for the KKK's public parades to be escorted by the police. Ooh, surprise. And the membership of the KKK and local police often overlapped heavily. Michael Ezra writes, while nonviolence was morally feasible and gained political sympathy for the movement, it also made civil rights protests an excessively dangerous activity that often intimidated people from participating. And so some of those in the South took a rather different approach. Next.
The Deacons for Defense. Long before the Black Panthers, Black people, especially in the American South, had organized themselves for self-defense, including armed self-defense. But those self-defense groups were often small, local, and informal. They were also clandestine in areas with a strong Klan presence. Black people who armed themselves wanted to avoid unnecessary attention. This is one of the reasons their history is not very well known. It also helped, as Lance Hill writes, to maintain the illusion of nonviolence in the movement. It was this public image of a nonviolent movement that ensured white liberal support in the North. Things changed with the emergence of Deacons for Defense. They organized publicly for the defense of Black communities. Founded in 1964 as a single group in Jonesboro, Mississippi, by 1966, they would have 21 chapters in the South with hundreds of active members and many thousands of supporters. Notably, they became active after the Civil Rights Act of 1964 had passed, when Black people were already supposed to be legally equal. Lance Hill tells the story of Deacons for Defense in his fascinating and insightful book, The Deacons for Defense, Armed Resistance, and the Civil Rights Movement. The founding members of the Deacons were mostly working class military veterans like Ernest Chilly Willie Thomas and Frederick Douglass Kirkpatrick. From the beginning, they tasked themselves with protecting Black communities and civil rights organizers from Klan violence. Hill writes, the Deacons guarded marches, patrolled the Black community to ward off night riders, engaged in shootouts with Klansmen, and even defied local police in armed confrontations. They didn't stop there. Quote, although the deacons began as a simple self-defense guard to compensate for the lack of police protection, they soon developed into a highly visible political organization with a clear and compelling alternative to the pacifist strategies promoted by national civil rights organizations. Hill explains, not alone in their disenchantment with passive resistance, the deacons reflected a growing disillusionment of working class Blacks with the pacifist, legalistic, and legislative strategies proffered by national organizations. Many African Americans, men in particular, refused to participate in nonviolent protests because they believed that passive resistance to white violence simply reproduced the same degrading rituals of domination and submission that suffused the master-slave relationship. Moreover, many African Americans regarded passive resistance and love for one's oppressor as dubious antidotes for immobilizing fear and resignation. Militant community defense allowed civil rights organizing that had been impossible before and encouraged community involvement in nonviolent activities as well. Before the Deacons, in the summer of 1963, CORE had tried and failed to desegregate public buildings like the library in Jonesboro. CORE had struggled to rally 20 protesters, but in December of 1964, the Deacons managed to gather 236 people to a civil disobedience action, occupying and desegregating the library in minutes. They soon desegregated other facilities as well, and their action gave courage to others, as Hill explains. The presence of the Deacons was clearly helping to overcome fear and passivity. In contrast to, wait a minute, where do we go?
Sorry, the cat just stepped on my keyboard.
Dang you, Murray and or Lorenzo. In contrast to their past timorousness, 3 ministers came forward and offered their churches for voter registration. Next.
I'm just trying to figure out where we're at. Oh, it's Logan's turn, isn't it? My bad.
No problem, Dominic. Organized self-defense encouraged Black activists to stand firm regardless of the tactics they were using. Many Black women who were domestic workers soon refused to tolerate racist insults on the job. Hill writes, the formation of the defense group reflected a profound change in the thinking of African Americans in Jackson Parish. A new state of entitlement and new combativeness were emerging in the Black consciousness. These changes were evident in men and women alike. Shortly after the defense unit formed, the Klan attempted to light a cross at the home of the Reverend Y.D. Jackson in rural Jackson Parish. As soon as the torch touched the cross, shots rang out. Jackson's wife had unloaded her gun at the startled Klansmen. The frightened night riders beat a hasty retreat. The white robe and hood were losing their mystique in Jonesboro. These early successes in Jonesboro did not immediately put a stop to the Klan. As the desegregation campaign gained ground, the KKK responded with intimidation, including cross burnings. In response, the Deacons printed leaflets stating that anyone caught burning crosses in Black communities would be shot, and they asked domestic workers to leave the leaflets anonymously in white homes where they worked. Such threats of deterrence aside, the Deacons were actually very restrained in their use of violence. They sometimes discouraged Klan drive-bys with other tactics, such as putting planks filled with nails across roads to flatten Klansmen's tires. Young people also felt empowered by the new spirit of defiance, and they grew tired of what they saw as the complacency and privilege of their liberal middle-class teachers and ministers. One day, the students at the Black Jackson High School in Jonesboro spontaneously walked out, smashing the school trophy case and portraits of school officials on the way. They demanded new textbooks, library improvements, and school integration, among other things. They also protested churches that refused to allow civil rights activities. The student strike lasted for weeks until the students won all their demands. The presence of the deacons also discouraged much of the state-level repression that had plunged the civil rights struggle. That had plagued the civil rights struggle. In 1965, the police threatened to attack a group of picketing students with high-pressure fire hoses. Fire hoses had been used against marchers in Birmingham several years earlier, injuring many activists, including children. But in Jonesboro, the deacons showed up at the student picket and began to conspicuously load their firearms. The police backed off. Next.
Police backed off. I'm looking for it. Can you guys hear me, by the way?
Yes, you sound
Yes.
all right on my end.
Alrighty. Do you want to highlight where I'm supposed to be reading from? Thank you. In addition to protecting their own community, the deacons would escort visiting civil rights workers, who were often avowed pacifists. Part of their goal was to defend those who would not defend themselves. As one deacon explained to a visiting CORE activist, "You guys can be nonviolent if you want to, and we appreciate you being nonviolent, but we're not going to stand by and let these Klan guys kill you." The deacon did not condemn nonviolence as a tactic. They simply declined to abide by it. They continued to support their nonviolent action, a solidarity pacifists didn't always reciprocate, and they regularly risked their lives to defend the physical well-being and the moral integrity of others. After all, violent attacks on civil rights workers were still common throughout the South, but not in Jonesboro. The one-armed attack on a civil rights worker in Jonesboro was deterred by a deacon who returned fire on white attackers and caused them to flee. I've said several times that resistance movements don't change their enemies by persuasion, but allies may find effective tactics to be very persuasive. In the town of Bogalusa, two white Corps members, Bill Yates and Steve Miller, were attacked by an angry racist mob who viciously beat them and tried to kill them. They managed to escape the mob for a few moments to slip into a tiny cafe, where they were met by a group of gun-wielding deacons. The deacons took up defensive positions and protected the two Corps workers from the mob outside. Hill writes, "It was a philosophical epiphany for Miller. Up to that point, I embraced the concept of nonviolence," said Miller. "Now necessity made him an apostate. At that point, I guess I said, oh, guess I'm not nonviolent anymore." Soon the Deacons for Defense expanded into other towns. The town of Bogalusa, Louisiana, had more KKK members per capita than any other town in the South, and the police tended to ignore racist vigilante attacks. Black people who used desegregated buildings might be attacked, severely beaten, or fired upon. They needed a response. And so a group of deacons organized in Bogalusa. Peaceful school integration in Bogalusa only succeeded when a line of well-armed black men, deacons, stared down a gun-toting mob of Klansmen. Indeed, the deacons not only defied the Klan, but the police as well, who wanted them to depart with unconvincing reassurances the police would handle the Klan. Again, the Klan did not simply give up and continued to oppose any move toward integration and equality in Bogalusa. The first black sheriff's deputy in the parish was murdered. A month later, a black protest march was attacked by a white mob as police stood by. One teenage girl, Hattie Mae Hill, was struck in the head by a brick. The marchers tried to get her into a car to transport her to medical treatment, but the white mob pushed forward to attack the injured girl, striking her and tearing at her clothes. A deacon named Henry Austin came to the girl's aid, drew his .38 caliber sidearm, and shot the nearest attacker in the chest. That attacker was a white man named Alton Crow. Whatever Crow was expecting, it wasn't a bullet. In Bogalusa, it had once been unimaginable that black people would defend themselves. Austin would later recall feeling sorry. Did I miss something? Austin would later recall feeling sorry for Crow after I shot him. because he had this incredulous look on his face. The white mob fled immediately. All right, next.
Members of the KKK were willing to kill people, but they were afraid to die themselves. Robert F. Williams, an organizer who was kicked out of the NAACP for advocating black self-defense, explained this in his 1962 book, Negroes with Guns. He wrote that racists consider themselves superior beings and are not willing to exchange their superior lives for our inferior ones. They are most vicious and violent when they can practice violence with impunity. He added, moreover, when because of our self-defense there is danger that the blood of whites may be spilled, the local authorities in the South suddenly enforce law and order when previously they had been complacent toward lawless, racist violence. Henry Austin would echo these comments. With Watts exploding a few weeks later, it made a lot of people think, especially at the federal level, that they had to intercede at a great level or there was going to be hell to pay in this country. The activities of the Deacons compelled police and federal officials to enforce laws against the KKK. And when Alton Crow survived his chest wound, the police declined to bring Henry Austin to trial. Hill writes, it soon became clear that most of the black community regarded Austin as a hero. After organizer Charles Sims bailed out the young Deacon, Austin returned to a warm welcome in Bogalusa. Men shook his hand and bought him drinks. Elderly women greeted him affectionately on the street and pressed a few dollar bills into his hand. Around the time of the Crow shooting, the Deacons were criticized by advocates of strict nonviolence like Martin Luther King Jr., who claimed that the Deacons tended toward aggressive violence. In part, such criticism reflects the different priorities within the civil rights movement. The middle-class national organizations tended toward nonviolence because they wanted to gain the sympathy of white Northern voters in their goal to get legislative change. The local working-class organizations, like the Deacons, had more immediate concerns of poverty and violence, so they took a more pragmatic approach in general. Nonviolence was an effective way of gaining the support of Northern white liberals because, to put it bluntly, they were sympathetic but racist. Hill explains, in the 1950s, many Northern whites retained old stereotypes of blacks as violent, vengeful, and impulsive. They believed that blacks lacked internal psychological constraints and self-discipline, and that they were incapable of forgiveness and generosity. It is no surprise that King's emphasis on forgiveness was so appealing to white liberals. They were the ones who benefited from race privilege. It was white people who needed to be forgiven, and King's attitude surely relieved their guilt more effectively than militant pronouncements of black power. Next.
Hill writes, quote, by giving the luster of religious precept to a pragmatic stratagem to attract white liberals, while accommodating liberal fears of black violence, the national civil rights leadership took the high moral ground and made their critics look like nihilistic advocates of violence. In truth, defense groups like the Deacons use weapons to avoid violence, unquote. While King and others tried to reduce white fearfulness, the Deacons actually wanted to make specific whites, like members of the KKK, afraid. While some national civil rights leaders criticized the Deacons, seeking to maintain the sympathy of white liberals, civil groups in the South depended on them. One organizer explained in a 1965 issue of Ebony magazine that the Deacons were assets, not liabilities, and essential to the civil rights struggle where they operated. Quote, if it wasn't for them, I wouldn't have the nerve to be driving around right now. People who say they are destructive seem to forget that they are protecting lives here, unquote. That Ebony article also reported, quote, actually, townsmen consider the Deacons a deterrent to violence in Bogalusa. For one thing, their very existence forces white troublemakers to think twice. For another, by giving the job to mature and restrained men, they discourage hotheads. Deacons themselves who prove unfit are dismissed from the organization. They don't fool around with the wild ones, insists a local housewife. unquote. This measured, cautious approach to recruitment would contrast with the later Black Panthers. In August of 1965, NAACP organizer George Metcalf was killed by a car bomb in Natchez, Mississippi. Black people there were ready to respond militantly. White audiences were shocked when they saw a Natchez preacher giving an interview on national television while holding a gun. A Natchez branch of the Deacons was organized. Comments by 25-year-old James Jackson summed up the mood in Natchez at the time. Quote, "Man, I done been to 135 meetings, and that's all they ever did was meet. You know what I'm talking about? And never does nothing, just planning. Negroes is the planning just people I've ever seen. Boy, we plan too damn much, man, and never do nothing." Jackson added, quote, "I believe, just like Martin Luther King and everybody else, I believe in nonviolence. I really do, man. I think that nonviolence is the only way to solve the problem, you know. On the other hand, I believe that our people should stop getting killed," unquote. The newly formed Natchez Deacons partnered with the nonviolent NAACP to carry out a 4-month-long boycott against downtown stores. The NAACP issued various demands to the municipal government and white business leaders, including more hiring of Black people and the creation of biracial advisory committee for the city council, and the integration of city facilities, schools, hospitals. They won all of these demands, Hill writes, quote, "Whereas virtually every other local campaign had ended in failure during the civil rights movement in Mississippi, the Natchez Project had mobilized an entire community and exacted sweeping concessions from the white establishment without benefit of federal intervention," unquote. The Natchez campaign was the single greatest community victory for the civil rights movement in Mississippi, though historians have never given it the credit it deserves. By any standard of community organizing, the campaign was a sterling success. The organizers united and inspired the community to courageous action. More than 500 demonstrators were arrested in 1 week and secured dramatic legal economic reforms. It was a strategy that skewed appeals to Northern conscience and instead forced local concessions through a combination of legal protest, economic coercion, and most importantly, militant force, in the form of armed self-defense and community discipline. Moreover, it was a strategy that succeeded where others had failed. Next.
Okay, so we only have 2 minutes left in the reading section. So I'm just going to read, even 1 minute. So I'm just going to read just a little bit, and then we'll end the reading section and move on to the discussion section. There's so much more to the civil rights struggle than the story of nonviolence alone. Black Muslims, like Malcolm X, were a militant and important part of the struggle. Even MLK did not entirely condemn violence in private. On at least one occasion, he was protected by the Deacons while visiting the South. He had armed bodyguards, and a visitor to his house during one campaign said that there were so many guns in his home that it looked like an armory. As early as 1964, if not earlier, many staffers in the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee had quietly armed themselves. By 1965, SNCC leadership was concerned that the organization was unable to catch up with the masses when it came to the growing grumbles against pacifism. SNCC would later pass a resolution that members should not carry arms themselves, but that it would be acceptable for outsiders like the Deacons to protect them with arms. Many of those in the civil rights struggle were firmly opposed to strict nonviolence. Some demonstrated this through words and some through action. Peter Gelderloos, in his excellent book, How Nonviolence Protects the State, argues that race riots, like the 5-day-long riot in the Watts neighborhood of Los Angeles, were both a rejection of nonviolence and a critical part of the struggle. They demonstrated that patience was running out, and that large numbers of Black people might abandon nonviolence if the government did not force change. I think that's probably a good place to end. It doesn't look like there's going to be like an organic ending point here. So I'll just copy this real quick so we don't lose where we were. All right. So that's where we can stop for today on the reading portion, but now we can move into the discussion portion. So I'm so happy to see so many people here. We've got a really good turnout. I just want to open the floor and see if anybody has any first thoughts. We had some really good stuff in our reading today.
Yes, McBay. Likes include Gelderloos. Dislikes include Gandhi.
Yeah,
I
was
love
gonna
how much he
say-
roasts Gandhi in this book.
Hearing Gandhi's name at this point gets me all kinds of assed up. Liberals bring it up every day.
No, I think this whole section did a good job of going through the actual narrative rather than the given political narrative that most people are given around these issues.
Yeah, every time that India and Gandhi comes up, or MLK comes up, or Nelson Mandela comes up, anytime any of them come up, it's always presented as if they were purely pacifistic movements and all they did was non-violently get beaten to death by their opponents. And that's why they won, through their moral goodness and never, ever fighting back.
Well, I think a really good point that he brought up reading section is the tendency of liberals, specifically white liberals in this case, to deliberately only go with measures that they know will be unsuccessful because they have a lot at stake. Like they want to be on the right side, but they also don't want to like give up any of those like privileges, you know?
Oh, yeah. An aversion to risk. Absolutely. I think that's at the core of liberal politics. I mean,
it's not even like he said it's not even an aversion to risk. Like his claim is that they don't want to give up like their privilege, and so while their comfort, and so while they want to be seen as on the right side, they are on the right side with ineffective things that they know to be ineffective simply so that they can maintain their privilege and their comfort, not just avoidance of risk, like both, kind of both.
yeah, worse than just avoidance of risk. So Ollie is asking, does anyone have any book recommendations that look more at movements that took over land for subsistence farming? Let me think about that. Well, I made a video about Siko Sasola, and Siko Sasola is a federation of cooperatives in Venezuela that essentially did do that. They essentially, the majority of these are agricultural cooperatives. I'll send you, I don't know if a book, I just read through some kind of like secondary sources, but like here's the Wikipedia, because that might be kind of hard to know what I'm saying here, but that one comes to mind. There's also, of course, the Zapatistas. I think the MST also has some of that going on, the landless peasants movement. Those are the ones that come to mind. Does anybody else have any thoughts about the reading? For my own part, I always really enjoy reading about the Deacons for Defense. I derive a great deal of joy out of
People
hearing
getting John Brown? Sorry.
Oh, but like I derive a great deal of joy out of them meeting the white supremacists with defense and violence, and the white supremacists just folding. it's delightful. You usually only get that kind of satisfying narrative in a fiction story.
The Deacons give off major John Brown energy, and I'm with it.
I also loved the planningest people I've ever seen. That quote was hilarious.
I felt personally called out by that.
That was so funny. He's like, I've been to 135 meetings and all we've done is meet.
We had meetings to plan meetings, and that's when you know, like, you're in too far.
So funny. So funny. Yeah, nailed that. Super hard.
Yeah, I don't know if y'all saw my comment that I was basically saying, like, this during this civil rights upset, and we read about the ambulances refusing to take the injured people into a hospital, and then of course, like, when they would manage to, like, get to a hospital, a lot of times they would also not get care at all, or just subpar care. This is how our modern street medic tradition was started. So it was basically because, not to be too spicy, but a lot of times EMS and a lot of times, like, EMS and cops work so closely together, but in these in these instances where there will be, like, dangerous, like, either like a riot or a protest, a lot of times police will disallow EMS from going into whatever's going on. And so this was how that was birthed. Just a side track.
Yeah, I think there's even some, like, origination of, like, emergency rooms or emergency services themselves originating from Black people creating dual power services for their own people because they weren't being treated. I think I was just hearing about that recently. But yeah, no, I love hearing about that whole history because, Black people in America have a whole history of creating dual power, right? Like, every time that their needs haven't been met in history, instead of, like, assuming that the power structure is going to provide them, they just go right to work creating their parallel institutions. And I find that very inspiring.
That's I honestly, I think that's an underexplored dynamic, and something that I'm seeing, like, right now in our modern time, is that the ultra conservative right wing, they're getting literally everything they wanted. They have gotten everything they wanted at this point, and they are still absolutely furious. They're still angry, and you have to think about, like, why are they angry? Well, in their minds, they thought that, like, people of color and just marginalized people in general were being just given these, all of the things that these communities have built for themselves. And in this, like, the racist conservative mind, they were being given those things on a platter. And so by, in their minds, removing the platter, they were like, well, then we're going to excel. Now they are failing to excel, but it's because they don't understand the tradition of marginalized people to create dual power and to create self-determination. So they're pissed and they don't even know why. Yes, Elephant Panda says the proverbial dog who has caught the car. That's exactly true. They don't even know what to do with it once they get it, and it's not working the way that they thought.
I wanted to mention something about nonviolence because earlier someone said that liberals are being dishonest just so that they don't take risk, and I'm sure many are, but like reviewer 2 said in the chat, there's a huge entire edifice of scholarship and research built to convince liberals that they're doing the right thing, like this kind of revisionist history. Like before reading this book, well, now myself for the second time, I didn't know that Gandhi was basically being kind of like all tyrannical with the movement because it wasn't happening the way he wanted to happen, and that his tactic failed 14 years before independence, and there was all these like directly democratic council and both nonviolence and armed resistance that led to victory. So yeah, there's like huge revisionist history that keeps happening again and again. And yeah, so I was actually gonna mention a great podcast. I'll put the link in the chat. Podcast episode that's entitled "It Isn't Nonviolent to Let People Hurt You," and it's basically a criticism of the book by Erica Chenoweth, Why Civil Resistance Works, the Strategic Logic of Nonviolent Conflict. That's kind of suggesting that only nonviolence works or is moral or whatever. So yeah, I thought I'd share that.
The Chenoweth stuff is interesting because her data, it's not as if she's not sampling examples. She has a ton it's really very robust in the number of examples that are in the data set. The main criticism that I keep hearing, and it seems accurate because I like downloaded the actual data set to go look at it. And the criticism I hear is that, well, you keep marking a bunch of these nonviolent that had flanking radical flanks, which were violent, right? Like, yeah, maybe the majority of the movement was nonviolent, but there was still the, armed radical flank, and you're just leaving that out. It can't just, we can't make an assessment that the nonviolence is what made the movement succeed when there was also the radical flank, because the radical flank could very well have made the nonviolent part of the movement more effective. It's like, ever since I was kind of learning about organizing, the history of this stuff, it's always been explained to me, and it seems like it's still accurate, is that, the nonviolent or the violent flank, or the radical flank, is there so that the people who are like the nonviolent ones can be like, hey, if you don't concede to my tactics, that's what you have waiting. Right.
That's exactly what it is. It's like a, for lack of a better term, it's a good cop, bad cop kind of arrangement where it's like, you can either like cooperate with us or we will come in with a heavy hand.
Right. Yeah, like reviewer says, Chenoweth is doing the sociologist thing, encoding her data in the way that leads to her glib conclusions. She coded the Carnation Revolution as nonviolent. Yeah, like she also, I think one of the ones that people kept thinking one of the most ridiculous ones was Vietnam was coded as nonviolent. And people kept being like, how did that even happen? How did your data set include that? Like, who makes that mistake? That's insane. Like very, very odd stuff. And I think that's really what people have pulled out of her data. And it's part of why maybe her data isn't quite as convincing once you comb through it. And it's not to say, of course, that, there aren't a variety of examples where the movement was like the vast majority nonviolent with only very isolated examples of violence or a very weak radical flank. Like every once in a while that works, but like not the majority of examples. And so all of those in her data that she coded as nonviolent, just because there was mostly nonviolence in there, that just, I don't know, it sort of ruins her conclusions, because damn, she went to all that trouble to gather all that data and then poisoned her own data. Like, that's just frustrating to me. Sorry.
I also just wanted to point out that Mahatma Gandhi was not as pure of a moral character as everybody likes to say he is. He was known to have done some pretty messed up stuff.
Yeah.
And got more people killed through his pacifist movement than people got killed during the actual insurrections.
Yeah, the thing, I think that, we haven't gotten to the specific examples where he tries to get people to not support the revolutionary councils. Like, I think we get to that a little bit later. Here they only mentioned that he like condemned like the more insurrectionary activity. But there was a part where they like started seizing massive portions, like entire municipalities and stuff. And then they start trying to set up directly democratic revolutionary councils of the people. And Gandhi tells them to shut down all of the councils. And it's like, damn, like he's not just ineffective, he's a counter-revolutionary. Like, that's pretty bad. So anybody else have any thoughts about the reading?
Well, I was just having although the author is clear that the federal support for desegregation was ambiguous at best, reading about the National Guard and the federal troops going in to escort Black students against racist mobs is especially, I don't know, surreal in these times.
Yeah, I kept, when I was reading, or when we were reading through that portion, my mind kept hoping for parallels so I could be like, yeah, maybe it isn't so bad. Maybe, maybe we'll just survive this and this will be how they wrote about it in the history books and stuff. And like, I mean, maybe that still is the case. Who knows? I try not to be a doomer, but yeah, but it's so hard to imagine that parallel in our time. Like imagining their the National Guard protecting a progressive law that was passed. I just, it's hard to imagine. The National Guard has now been fully politicized. They're being used as an occupying counterinsurgency in the United States.
It makes me wonder how they feel about being used, how they feel about being the president's cuck. Like, they're getting fucked over like so bad. Their whole thing was to protect American soil, right? And so like their thing, like the military and National Guard, like their thing is to be protecting our borders from external threats. And now they're basically like relegated to like beat cops and like park trash collection. And it's just, they're also like having them do cycles of 29 days so that they don't have to give them any like per diem. They don't have to give them any shelter. They don't have to like cover any kind of like housing or food for them. So they'll do like a 29-day cycle and then have them off the cycle for one day and then back for another 29-day cycle, just so that they don't have to give them any benefit of National Guard duties.
Just like when they don't want to give us full-time hours, so they put us in for like 34, 35 hours a week or something.
Precisely.
Yeah.
Precisely.
Mm-hmm.
So they're keeping it one day under the number that they would have to do that. And it's like, how does that feel? I just want to ask these guys, like, how does it feel? Like, is this what you signed up for? You signed up for Americans to be afraid of you and for you to get treated like a cuck?
Yeah. I bet it's inconsistent, but I bet that there is a significant contingent of them who are very displeased, and I once saw a guy that what he did is he would go out with a with like he did what are the name of the broadcasts that they did in Vietnam that were trying to discourage the GIs? I don't remember what it was. What was her name? It doesn't matter. It was like Hanoi something, Hanoi Rose, maybe. Is that what it was? Anyway, but he went out there and he was like essentially playing that to the National Guard troops. And yeah, numerous of them looked like, what the hell am I doing here? Like no, really though, they're right. They're right. Like that was the look on their faces.
I have no sympathy for that. Like, throw down your arms or turn them on your bosses, and then I will have sympathy. But like the malicious compliance, like that's just not. It's not enough. It's not enough. Like, they're. I have no sympathy, and like I honestly, even after all this is over, I will not have sympathy for whatever kind of what's it called, like whatever kind of ego injury, moral injury that they may report having over all this. Then you shouldn't have been participating. But yeah, Hanoi Hana, I like that meant that psychological trip is like, it's definitely working here. Like, especially like I see, like the aunties out there talking to the guys, like, do you think that they're gonna protect your family when it's time for them to be collected? And the guys just like they look like they're gonna cry, and it's like, well, then throw down your arms or turn them against our oppressors, turn them against the tyrannical people.
I don't know if the National Guard even signs as coercive of contracts as people that are like in the Army and the Marines and all that. I think it's more like a job, but I could be wrong. I don't have any expertise on that.
It's less coercive, but if you were to ask me, would I rather help a fascist regime, or would I sit in prison for however long? It would be prison. 100% immediately.
Oh yeah, I know it's definitely time to ditch. If you're in the armed forces, get out ASAP. They're about to make you do even more terrible things than you're used to.
Well, the thing is, we will have American Nuremberg trials. Like, these guys will lose power because fascism is a loser movement. It's a loser movement. It always loses. Every time it comes up, it loses. And every time it loses, there are always trials afterwards. And the people who were complicit in it, they get hanged.
Yeah.
They get executed.
I would like to point out that would not exactly be the case in like Spain. Franco ruled for his whole life before the fascist regime collapsed. I will grant that it fell immediately after, though. At least as long as the dictator alive, there's a chance it can survive, but I have never seen it.
I mean, our dictator has all of like 3
Yeah,
weeks.
bro has 2 seconds. I don't know about that.
He's falling apart as we speak. I mean, yeah. Oh, sorry. Go Zan.
Oh, sorry, I didn't mean to do that. But I was gonna say, but JD Vance is a young chicken, so I don't know that it would collapse.
Well, I don't think that he can. I don't think
He
he's
is
that
not
lucky.
charismatic.
Yeah, I don't think he's capable of holding up the coalition.
I was going to say fascism is held together by its leader. So after Hitler died,
the
regime
for him is that technocracy money.
Yeah, it's not just one person, it's tons of people behind. As long as they get their way, I don't think they care so much about charismatic leaders, but I don't know. I guess we'll see.
The thing is that, like, with the charismatic leader now, the regular people support what's going on, even though it's clearly against their interest. But when they're just a bunch of soulless people that are ushering in a tech oligarchy, I don't know if it'll be the same without somebody like Trump.
Yeah,
Well,
I mean,
in case we can't really count on just waiting for him to croak to see.
no,
I will have.
But I will say that, insofar as that there's any form of like voting that remains, and they're not just like straight rigging the elections. I don't think JD Vance can win an election. I don't think that he has that kind of zealot behind, they're not as zealotous about him as a leader. In fact, they kind of seem to hate him already. Like, a lot of the MAGA people don't like JD Vance. And I just really don't think they have a character to seize the vacuum like Donald Trump. So what they'd have to do is run a different kind of campaign. Their fascism is going to be a little bit more difficult to enact because they don't have their it's bizarre calling him charismatic, but to the sort of chud mind, I suppose he's their charismatic leader.
Have you ever listened to Hitler's speeches? They sound shockingly alike if you actually understand what Hitler's saying.
That's because they're both on meth. Like, they're both on like lab grade, like literal methamphetamine salts. And I'm not talking about like the street shit, but yeah, it's absolutely like incoherent psychobabble, but it doesn't matter because people operate based on vibes. I can literally tell somebody to go to hell in a way that makes them want to ask me for directions. It doesn't matter what you say, it matters how you make them feel. And so, like, yeah, these these guys that are in this like evil charismatic role, where they're basically tapping into the temper tantrums of the right wing. That's really kind of like all that's needed. They don't have to say any words that make sense. It's going to be interpreted in however the listener wants to interpret it.
I just want to note that we have about 3 minutes left. So if anybody's got any sort of closing thoughts.
Nazis are bad, okay?
Yeah, no, it used to be an uncontroversial opinion. I guess not so much these days, huh?
Oh,
Well,
look.
The Deacons for Defense stories made me think of the fact that, well, things are escalating against trans people as a group in the US. And then that was even like debated before what happened last week, but removing gun access, gun rights for trans people, that was something I'm sure they're still mulling over. But yeah, I was just thinking of that when reading the Deacons for Defense section, apropos of nothing.
Right, yeah, definitely no parallels there, right? Yeah, no, we'll see how that goes. I will say, I don't usually give the right wing credit, but on this one issue, they have been pretty consistent. Not the rulers, but the constituency. They were very unhappy with the first announcements about the Trump administration possibly limiting access to guns for trans people, and this was even in right wing like Twitter discussions. There would be a flood of right wingers just absolutely tearing down the administration for the idea.
They were literally like angry at the fact that they were being forced to like defend trans people. They're like, can't believe you fuckers are making me, defend trans people's rights at this point. But basically, like, I think the thing is that we have on the left who have done an effective job of pointing out that gun laws and gun restrictions, it has a way of creeping back around to bite everybody in the ass. Just like, with NRA, they initially were a huge part of how the gun restrictions laws got passed. And then they found out very quickly after that, those laws were now applied to the white men. And they were like, well, shit, I can't believe the leopard eating or the face eating leopards ate my face. And so now that is being turned towards trans people this time, I think that they know that like the face eating leopards will eat their face as well, that it will be applied to them as well.
Yeah, it's weird that they can see that only on the gun issue. That's it. They can only understand that principle when it comes to the gun issue. On no other principle can they understand it. But yeah, no, I mean, we'll find out what happens. They're doing real good. They're doing real good at weaponizing the Charlie Kirk death. So we'll find out what kind of support they can gin up to violate their own principles any day now. But also, we are at time for the session. That was an excellent session, and I'm super glad everybody showed up, both on the YouTube, but also here in the study group. I just want to remind anybody who's listening on the YouTube, if you want to be in the discussion group, actually like reading and talking after we finish the reading portion, you should go over to our Open Collective and become a recurring donor. That is in the link to the Cooperation Tulsa YouTube video description. I also put it here in the chat if you just want to access it that way. Just go become a recurring donor. Send us a message really on any platform. Probably just sending us a message on, excuse me, on Instagram would probably be the easiest way to get a hold of us. And we will just give you an invite to the Cooperation Tulsa Discord server. And that way you'll actually even be able to just like talk with the members and you'll like be in the know about all the stuff we're doing. But that's the main thing I wanted to note. I appreciate everybody showing up and I enjoyed our conversation, and I'll see you the week after next. Next week will be Theo's Popular Education group. So just show up this time next Monday if you want to hang out with Theo.
Yeah, come hang out with me and let's watch educational videos together. All right, good night, y'all.
Have a great night, everybody.
Bye, everybody.
Good night,
Have a good
everyone.
one.
Take care.